Hey YouTube, welcome to another episode of Comics and Stuff. My name is Devin. I am your host as always. Thank you for tuning in. Hope everybody has had a fantastic week. Today's video is about the Comics Code Authority. What is the Comics Code Authority? So I'm sure you guys have heard me mention it quite a few times, especially in recent videos when I've been talking about the history of DC, Marvel Comics, things like that. And it's actually played a huge role in the history of comic books. If you guys are new to comic books, this may be something that you have never heard of. And if you are a little better acquainted with comic books, you may have a better idea. But for those of you who have never heard of the Comics Code Authority, it's that on older comic books, you'll see in the top left corner a little seal. It looks like a little postage stamp that says seal of the comics, or approved by the Comics Code Authority. And that is what we're going to be talking about today. What that little stamp is, and why it's there. So let me kind of give you, this is gonna kind of be like a rundown of what it is, the rules were, and how it came to be. So the Comics Code Authority was formed in 1954 by the Comic Magazine Association of America. It was made as an alternative to government regulations, and kind of like a solution for publishers to self-regulate as opposed to having the government, I guess, enforce censorship upon them. And then government regulation, it was threatened because of overwhelmed public concern over horrific and scary, gory content in comic books. A lot of this actually was attributed to Frederic Wertham and his book Seduction of the Innocent, which you guys, I'm sure, have heard me mention before. So a lot of the gory and horrific content that was causing public outcry, it was things like decapitations, needles, bondage, graphic sexuality, and etc. So the code itself was actually based off of an older and widely unenforced comics code that was drafted by the Association of Comic Magazine Publishers, which was actually loosely based off of a 1930s Hollywood code. So the Comics Code Authority was based off of an old comics code, which was based off an old movie code. So, like I said, Frederic Wertham, his book Seduction of the Innocent was largely to blame for the Comics Code Authority being enacted. The book itself widely criticized all of the sexuality and gore, but it also accused things like Batman and Robin being gay, and that used to be like a bad thing back in the 1950s. Same thing with he had criticisms against Wonder Woman. He had criticisms against all sorts of everything, basically. He just thought comic books were real bad, and he did his very best to convince everybody that they were real bad, and it kind of worked for a while. So, what were the rules of the Comics Code Authority? What kind of did that seal include? So it included a few things. One, people of authority in comic books should not be placed in a situation that would advertise disrespecting established authorities. So you couldn't publish a comic book that had somebody disrespecting police. You always had to respect police or mayors, judges, whatever, people who are an authority figure. Good must always triumph over evil, so the bad guys could never win in the Comics Code Authority. Decapitations, excessive blood, gore, sex, bondage, things like that, they were forbidden. You could not publish comic books with that sort of stuff. That also gave rise to things like Zap Comics, but I'll talk about that later. You couldn't have creatures like, werewolves, zombies, vampires. Those were considered too scary, so they were no longer allowed in comic books at this time. Granted, the Comics Code Authority was amended later in the future. And then lastly, you could not have comic books that had the words horror or terror in the title. So, terror from beyond or something like that, or anything like that was not allowed. Horror stories, things like that. So only two major comic book publishing companies were actually exempt from the Comics Code Authority and did not partake in that program. That was Gold Key and Dell Comics, but that's because they actually answered to their licensors. They weren't creating their own personal stories like Superman and Batman, while they came from people who worked for DC Comics or sold the characters to DC Comics. Dell and Gold Key were publishing characters such as Disney or things like that. So there's that. Its restrictions caused companies like Fiction House Comics, EC Comics to either close up shop or become so unprofitable that they had to cancel all of their series and reopen with a different product. So if you guys watched my story on Fiction House or EC, I think I've released both by now. I mean, you would have heard mention of those stories. Let's see here. I have all my notes open, just like normal. So, in the 1960s, the Comics Code, its tough restriction gave rise to Zap Comics, which is what I mentioned a little bit ago, and other underground comics that were sold outside of your regular comic shops. So a lot of comic book shops in the 1960s would only sell comic books that had the Comics Code Authority seal on the books. If they did not, comic shops would refuse to sell them. So these Zap comics, which had comic books about being gay, using drugs, having sex, bondage, crime, things like that, they were sold in outside, I guess, entities. They weren't at comic shops. You could find them in bars or bookstores, things that kind of fell outside of the comics medium, and people could pick those books up there, or specialty shops, things like that. In the early 2000s, I think it was 2001, Marvel Comics abandoned the Comics Code Authority, so they said that they were no longer going to partake in it, and they took the seal off of the inside of its comics. And then by 2010, only Archie Comics, DC, and Bongo Comics, they were the only ones that still adhered to the code, but they had all abandoned it by 2011, rendering the Comics Code Authority defunct. So the Comics Code Authority went from 1954 to 2011, which is an extremely long time in it, and it regulated comic books. It had a huge impact on how stories were written, what characters that were created, and so forth. So that was, a huge thing in the comic book industry. The rights to the Comics Code Authority and all of its statutes were actually purchased and are now owned by the CBLDA, the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, or CBLDF, Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, which is a company that's dedicated to, I guess, like defending comic book owners, creators, writers' rights. For example, there was a incident in Canada where a gentleman had anime on his computer, but it depicted a child, being displayed in a sexual manner, and Canadian authorities seized it and called it child pornography. But he contacted the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund and said, hey, I need your help. And they actually successfully defended him by saying, hey, this is art. It is anime. It is an art form. In no way is this guy like a pedophile. This is just a book that he was reading. I'm not going to talk about my personal opinion, but that's like an example of, that's one of their more famous cases. But so yeah, nowadays the Comics Code Authority is, defunct. People don't talk about it. It's, you can buy a shirt that has the code on it, which is cool, or the stamp on it. But yeah, that is what it is. So I hope this was enlightening for some of you guys. If it wasn't, tell me what I could have done better. Make sure that you put it in the links or put it in the comments below. Feel free to hit me up on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and tell me, guys, how much you enjoyed this. So that's it. Thank you for tuning in, and I will see you guys next Friday.